Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everybody. There were 2 handouts everybody should have gotten. You can see that we are coming into the home stretch in this course that started 2 years ago. Okay, and then the other handout I will come to in the course of the class. Okay, so we've been discussing the development of panya, or wisdom, in terms of the 5 aggregates, the 12 sense bases, and the elements. And so last time we went through the 4 elements, which takes us to page 350 in the book. This is the section that is concerned with the contemplation of 6 elements. Normally we speak about 4 elements, the 4 material elements, but sometimes the list of elements gets expanded to 5 elements by bringing in the space element, and then 6 elements by bringing in the element of consciousness. And when consciousness is mentioned, then we could understand that the entire mental side of life is comprised under the heading of consciousness. So we have we could say that the scheme of the elements balances the scheme of the 5 aggregates. In the 5 aggregates, one has emphasis more on the mental side of experience. You have just one aggregate. The form aggregate comprises the entire physical or bodily side of existence. And then we have 4 aggregates representing the mental side: feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. The scheme of the 6 elements, we have 5 material elements. 4 of them are considered the primary constituents of matter, the 4 great elements. Then we have the space element, which is a kind of considered a material phenomenon, which is derived from the 4 elements, or is contingent upon them. Since if there were not the 4 elements, there would not be the space element. And then the entire conscious side of existence, or mental side of existence, is represented by the consciousness aggregate. Okay, now the passage that we are going to be examining explains one of the methods of contemplating the elements. I'm going to treat this primarily in terms of the 4 material elements. Okay, so in this sutta, the Buddha is speaking to a wandering ascetic, a wandering monk. It's a somewhat interesting background story. At the time the sutta opens, there is a young man who has become on his own a Buddhist ascetic out of devotion to the Buddha, out of trust in the Buddha. He had learned something about the Buddha's teachings, and then he decided he wanted to become a monastic follower of the Buddha. So he put on saffron robes and he went wandering in order to meet the Buddha. At the same time, the Buddha was traveling alone through the countryside and came one night, this young monk stopped for the night to spend the night in the shed of a potter. This was common in ancient India. Potters, there would be potter shops all over. And the potter would have a shed where he keeps his, I guess, the utensils that he makes for storage. And so this young wandering monk came, asked the potter for permission to spend the night there, settled in, and then was sitting in meditation. Then the Buddha was wandering through the countryside alone. He arrived at the potter's shed at the same time, but slightly after the young man did. It also asked for the potter permission to spend the night there. The potter allowed him. And so the Buddha came in, but this young monk had never seen the Buddha before, so he didn't recognize him as the Buddha. And they just started a conversation. The Buddha asked the young man, "Under whom have you gone forth? Who is your teacher?" Then the young monk said, "I am a devotee of the one that they call the Buddha, who's now living in Savatthi." So at the time I think they're in Rajagaha. So he's now living in Savatthi and I'm on my way to meet him. And the Buddha doesn't reveal his identity, but just engages in a conversation with the young man. And then at a certain point the Buddha says, "I will teach you the Dhamma," but without revealing that he is the Buddha. And then the Buddha starts to give this discourse on how to develop wisdom. Okay, so the Buddha says, how does one not neglect wisdom? And now the Buddha is going to explain this in terms of the 6 elements. So he enumerates the 6 elements: earth element, water element, fire element, air element, space element, and the consciousness element. My memory is getting a little cloudy. Last week, did I speak about the actual meaning of the 4 elements in terms of their qualities? But you were in Bodhi Monastery. You might have picked it up in Bodhi Monastery. Did I speak about it here?
Yes, you did. Yes. You did.
I did.
Yes.
What the earth element represents?
Solidity.
Okay, I spoke about that. Thank you. Because I've been giving that talk several times recently. It was getting vague in my memory whether I explained that here in Tuanyen or was just carrying the memory through from explaining it at Bodhi Monastery 2 weeks ago. Okay, so the earth element is represented, or the earth element is a kind of figure of speech that represents the property of solidity. But if one wants to contemplate the earth element as a meditative exercise, what one does is to choose as the basis for investigation those parts of the body, those tissues and organs, in which the earth element is most prominent, most easily observed. And so here the Buddha will enumerate as the representatives of the earth element 20 components of the body. So he says, what is the internal earth element? First, the earth element might be internal or external, within oneself or outside oneself. So what is the internal earth element? Okay, whatever internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified, and clung to. Here this word clung to is a kind of metaphor in Pali, which means organic. And then these words solid, solidified, or hard and solid, those indicate the distinctive characteristic of the earth element. Its solidity, hardness. And so this is seen in head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, then flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, intestines, mesentery, stomach, feces, or whatever else internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified, and clung to. This is called the internal earth element. Okay, so in this way, one undertakes the contemplation by focusing on the body. It's not just a simple conceptual enumeration. At the beginning, one begins using conceptual enumeration to think of these parts of the body. But as one goes through the body, one has to develop increasingly subtle mindfulness, applying the attention, the mindfulness to each of these parts of the body until, as one goes through this, one can discern more and more distinctly the quality, the property of hardness or solidity in those parts that are being mentioned. Okay, so the Buddha mentions 20 parts, and then to bring in all of the other parts in which the earth element is present, he says whatever else internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified, and clung to. Okay, so this is called the earth element. And now the Buddha is going to proceed in a way to show how the observation or contemplation of the earth element and each of the other elements can be used as a doorway or channel for gaining insight into the characteristic of anatta, the characteristic of non-self. Okay, so one begins, or one moves on to the next step by saying that the internal earth element and the external earth element are simply earth element. Usually we distinguish the outer world, including the bodies of all other people, as being external to us, and then we take the body to be mine or what I am. But when one dissects the body, investigates it in terms of the elements, one sees first that the body is composed basically of the 4 elements. And then one could also see that there is not a sharp distinction between the earth element of the body and the earth element, the external earth element. For example, every day we eat food. When the food is on the plate, we could say if it's hard food, solid food, it's external earth element, or at least it has external earth element. Then I eat the food, digest it, the body assimilates it, and it then becomes internal earth element. Well, usually we don't think the feces are mine, but we think that's part of my body, but then we go to the toilet and excrete the feces, and then it's no longer ours, no longer part of us, but just part of the outer world. And maybe the feces get flushed, they might get channeled to some place where they're used for fertilizer, then they become part of the soil, that reabsorb into plants, then the plants turn into food, and then we eat it again. So there's this continuous cycle between the external and the internal. Okay, so now, as one goes on contemplating how there is this continuity or continuum between the internal earth element and the external earth element, one sees they're both simply earth element. And then one has to see this earth element as it really is with correct wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. So one applies this to the body, and one expunges or removes this tight identification with the body. Mine, I, myself. Because one sees how this body is just something composed of earth element, which is basically identical with external earth element. Okay, then when one sees the body as it really is, with correct wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the earth element. That is, one no longer builds up these illusions and delusions around the earth element, mine, I, and myself. Instead, the mind starts to turn away from this clinging and grasping of the body. And in this way, one makes the mind move towards viraga, dispassion, regarding the earth element of the body. Okay, so this is the contemplation of the earth element. Then we move into the contemplation of the water element. The water element, as I explained, has the characteristic, the mark of fluidity, liquid, oozing, wetness. Okay, so the earth, the water element, it might be either internal or external. What is the internal water element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is water, watery, and clung to, or organic. Okay, then the text will enumerate 12 components of the body, 12 kinds of fluids in which the earth element is most conspicuous. So these parts of the body are representing the water element. Okay, there's bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, spittle. What's called grease here is the vasa. It's the grease of the skin, kind of oily substance on the skin. Spittle, snot, oil of the joints. This is called medical term, I think, is synovial fluid. It's a kind of fluid inside the joints, which enable the arms to bend, the legs to bend without pain. If that synovial fluid dries up, then one gets arthritis. Okay, urine, the last, or whatever else internally belonging to oneself is water, watery, and clung to. This is called the internal water element. Okay, so 12 parts in the body in which the water element is most distinctive, parts taken to represent the water element. Then, again, the Buddha establishes this continuity. Now both the internal water element and the external water element are simply water element. They both have the same characteristic, the characteristic of flowing, fluidity, wetness. And there is a constant interchange, a constant exchange between the water of the outer world, what we call external water element, and the water of the body, the liquid of the body. I get thirsty, so I'll drink some water. Well, the fire element is a little prominent right now. That's okay, I can manage it. Okay, so we drink maybe 6 cups of water, 8 cups of water a day. So what's in external water element we drink it, it gets absorbed into the body, part of the body, and other liquids are getting flushed out, and they come out in the form of urine. And then when the urine gets discharged, then the water element of the body becomes external water element. Also, even not only what we drink, but constantly the pores of the skin are taking in fluid from the outside, the water, vapor from the air, and they're also excreting liquid waste from the body, which goes out and becomes part of the external water element. Okay, so when we see how there is this continuity between the internal water element, the external water element, how they all have the same characteristic of flowing fluidity, then we can see how this water element of the body is actually not mine, not I, not myself. And so one examines it thus with correct wisdom, and then one becomes disenchanted with the water element and makes the mind dispassionate, or detached from the water element. Okay, then we come to the fire element. The fire element is that feature of the natural world which exhibits the quality of hotness or heat. And all material phenomena have some degree of heat, even when it's cold. If I touch a cold surface, maybe if I touch a block of ice, there's still heat in that ice. It's just that relative to my own body, the fire element is of lower proportion compared to the fire element in my own body. But everything above absolute zero has some degree of the fire element. Okay, so we see the fire element in our own body in the heat of the body. Okay, so what is the fire element? The fire element might be internal or external. What is the internal fire element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is fiery and clung to. That is, that by which one is warmed. Okay, this is the natural bodily heat. Under normal conditions, 98.6 or so temperature Fahrenheit. Then that by which one ages. This might seem a little bit strange. How does one age because of the fire element? Okay, but this is an Indian belief, probably part of the indigenous Indian physiology even before the time of the Buddha, that fire or heat is the factor which causes things to grow old, to exhibit the mark of oldness or decay. Maybe they observe that if you take fruit and put it in a cold place, it lasts a long time. They didn't have refrigerators then, but perhaps they put it in cool places, in the shade, maybe in cool places cooled by cool water. But if you expose the fruit to the hot sun, then the fruit dries up, or it quickly turns and decays and becomes overripe. And so from this they inferred that the heat element in the fire element in the body is what causes the body to decay. Maybe they also noticed that people who have fiery temperaments seem to show the features of aging more quickly than people who are calm, tranquil. So maybe this is why meditation helps people to look very young for longer periods. So sometimes one sees elderly meditators, like he might be 70 years old, and people say, how can you be so old? You look like you're about 45 years old. Because the mind is very calm and peaceful, features are fresh. There's somebody who gets angry easily, is always complaining, always criticizing others, always has a grouchy mind. Those kind of disturbing thoughts, fiery thoughts, cause the body to become decrepit more quickly. So if you want to look young and beautiful, remove anger and meditate. Okay, so this is why the body is warm, it ages and gets consumed. So eventually, like when the body reaches real old age and all of its faculties deteriorate, this is because of the heat element. And then that by which what is eaten, drunk, consumed, and tasted gets completely digested. Here they observe that it's the heat element, we would say in the form of the hydrochloric acid in the stomach, that causes the food to get digested. In fact, what is digestion but it's the oxidation of the food, isn't it? And oxidation, and when things burn, it's just a rapid process of oxidation. So even digestion is a kind of slow process of burning up the food, turning it into energy. Okay, so these are 4 manifestations of the fire element. Bodily warmth, aging, the consumption of the body, and digestion. And anything else internally belonging to oneself that is fiery and clung to, this is called the internal fire element. Okay, both the internal fire element and the external fire element are simply fire element. So we have this heat of the body and the heat, for example, the heat of the sun. In fact, it's the heat of the sun that makes possible living bodies, organic bodies. If we were living, well, we couldn't be living. If we take a planet that's too far from the sun so that it doesn't get enough heat, it's not possible for life to arise there. For life to arise, a certain amount of heat is necessary for chemical reactions to take place, to bring life into being. Okay, so it's the heat of the sun which makes possible organic bodies which have their own organic heat. And our own bodies are also constantly giving off heat, which gets absorbed into the atmosphere. And often human beings are also doing things, sometimes very foolish things, which expel chemicals into the atmosphere, which cause the atmosphere to heat up, even to the point where it poses a risk to the future of life on this planet. Okay, so internal heat fire element, external fire element, both the fire element. Again, one sees this as it really is, not mine, not I, not myself. One becomes disenchanted with the fire element, and the mind becomes dispassionate towards it. Okay, then we come to the air element. The air element represents the property, it has several features, the property of expansion and contraction, the property of pressure, the property of motion, movement. These are manifestations of the air element. Okay, so what is the air element? It might be internal or external. What is the internal air element? Okay, whatever internally belonging to oneself is air, airy, and clung to. We might say whatever belonging to oneself is a gas or a gaseous state and clung to. Okay, there's upgoing winds. Again, this appeals to the Indian physiology. There are considered to be certain winds in the body that move up the lower part of the body to the upper part of the body. Then certain winds, downgoing winds, winds which move from the upper part of the body to the lower part of the body. Winds in the belly, in the stomach, winds in the bowels and the intestines, winds that course through the limbs. This is an interesting point in the Indian physiology. What we would now think of as nerve currents, the kind of nerve currents that cause movement of the limbs, in Indian physiology was thought of as a kind of wind, a stream or channel of wind that moves into the limb and causes motion. So the way the Buddhist texts, Buddhist commentaries explain motion, first there takes place a volition in the mind or a decision. I want to lift my arm, let's say. So first there comes the thought or the inner command, lift the arm. Then that inner thought causes, it activates the wind element. And so some aspect of some kind of wind moves from the heart base, where according to the Indian physiology, the thought originates. So that wind element moves from the heart base to the arm, then through the arm, causing the arm to lift. Similarly, if I want to drop the arm, another command comes from the mind or heart, drop the arm, and then that activates the air element. It sets going a current of wind through the arm that causes the arm to drop. Okay, so if somebody gets arthritis and then you go to a traditional Indian physician, they'll do a check on your pulses, check on certain points in the body, and then they'll say that you're suffering from an imbalance of the wind element. And then they'll prescribe some herbal medication to reduce the activity of the wind element. Okay, so winds that move through the limbs, and then in-breath and out-breath. Okay, so these are, I think there's 6. Upgoing, downgoing, winds through the belly, winds through the bowels, winds through the limbs, in-breath and out-breath. 6 manifestations of the wind, of the air element. And whatever else internally belonging to oneself is air, Aryan, clung to, this is called the internal air element. Okay, the rest is the same. And we could see the constant exchange of the internal air element and the external air element. We breathe in, the body takes the oxygen, then the blood going through the blood vessels picks up carbon dioxide, other waste gases, brings it to the lungs, then we breathe out. And so these gases get expelled from the body, they become part of the external air element. And so constantly breathing in, breathing out, we're always exchanging the inner air element with the external air element. So in this way, there's no essential difference between the inner air element and the external air element. Okay, at this point I just want to take a little pause. Maybe I could ask whether there's any question about the 4 elements as explained here. Richard?
The term clung to, is that upadana or is it something else?
It's upadina, which is a past participle based on the noun upadana. But it doesn't, the way it's understood, it doesn't mean, at least I don't think it means that it's clung to in the sense that there's clinging in the mind which is holding to it. It just seems to be an expression that was used in that time. And the way I understand it, it's used almost the way we would use the word organic today. Any further questions? Okay, then I just want to now explain 2 methods of undertaking the meditation on the 4 elements. One method is the method which is explained here. This, we could say, is the more conceptual method. So that one begins by taking these parts of the body. One goes through the body, first taking the earth element. In one's mind, one enumerates the parts that represent the earth element. Then one takes the water element. In one's mind, one enumerates the parts of the body which represent the water element. Again, then one moves to the fire element, goes through those 4 aspects of the fire element. Then one goes to the wind element, to the air element, and goes through those 6 aspects representing the wind element, the air element. Then one goes back to the earth element, follows through again to the air element, over and over and over again, each time focusing more closely on each of the parts, trying to feel it, to experience it within the body, so that as one practices this continuously, many hours a day, day after day, the mindfulness becomes so subtle that one could pick up the feeling of that part in the body, at least with many of them. Okay, the other element, the other method of practicing the meditation on the elements is a more concise method which works with the more concrete experience characteristic of the elements. In this method, one takes the qualities of each of the elements. Okay, so in the case of the earth element represents, it's seen most conspicuously in the property of hardness or solidity. But there's a kind of continuum from hardness to softness. And so softness is also representing the earth element, but cases where the earth element is less prominent. So in something like the cup, the earth element is more prominent. Or in terms of the body, we could say in the teeth, the fingernails, bones, the earth element is more prominent. In flesh, the muscle, the earth element is less prominent because there's softness. Okay, the water element can be experienced in two ways. One is the property of fluidity or flowing. The other way, it's said that the water element has the property of cohesion. I explained this, I think I explained that last time, how it's through the addition of water to particles that the particles of flour will bind together, or particles of clay will bind together. So in the body too, it's the water element which binds the particles of earth element together to form the substance of the body. And so if one attends to the body very closely, very carefully, one could experience a kind of cohesive force holding the body together. Okay, so that is how the water element is experienced. Then the fire element is experienced most distinctly in the heat of the body. But also when it's cold, when parts of the body are cold, that is also a manifestation of the fire element, but a case where the fire element is recessive or diminished. Its presence is relatively diminished. But this continuum from hot to cold is the scale for measuring the presence of the fire element. Then the air element is seen in the sense of pressure within the body, the movements that take place in the body, and most conspicuously in expansion and contraction within the body. Okay, so there's a way to move into the meditation on the elements without going through this list of organs and tissues. In this way of developing the meditation on the elements, one begins by trying to capture a clear and distinct experience of the dominant characteristic of each element. So beginning with the earth element, to get a sense of hardness, one takes some part of the body where one can experience the hardness very distinctly. So one might, for example, click the teeth together, or even put the fingers on the teeth to feel the hardness of the teeth. Or one could feel the top of the skull, press the top of the skull. One feels the resistance of the skull. Or feel the elbow, where one can experience the hardness of the bones. So one begins by taking this characteristic of hardness, focusing on it, till it becomes clearer, more distinct. Then one starts going through the body until one could pick up the sensation of hardness or solidity in other parts of the body. One keeps on going through the body over and over, and as one repeatedly undergoes this exercise, the mind becomes more refined, more subtle, so that one could pick up at increasing levels of subtlety the sensation of hardness in the body, until one reaches a point where one could just scan the body and pick up the sensation of hardness throughout the whole body. Then one moves into the contemplation of the liquid element or of the water element. And so one can begin by taking a sensation of flowing within the body. For example, one could even start by just taking even a sip of water and then slushing the water around in the mouth to experience some sense of the flowing of liquid in the body. Or one could just move the saliva around in the mouth. If it's very hot, one might feel the wetness of sweat that's coming out, drops of sweat. Okay, then one focuses upon this feature or characteristic of fluidity and then starts examining the rest of the body to pick up the sense of fluidity. Or the alternative approach with the water element, and this is what I found somewhat easier to do. More difficult at the beginning, but eventually more, let's say it's more pervasive. And that is to use the characteristic of cohesion. One has to get a sense of how the body is holding together, of a kind of binding force that holds the body together. If one can pick up that sense of a binding force, that feeling of a binding force in one place, then one can start running the mind over the body until one gets a sense throughout the whole body of some kind of force holding the body, binding it into a unity. And then one keeps on going through the body, attending to that sense of cohesion, of binding together, until one experiences at very subtle levels the particles of the body holding together, locked together through the function of the water element. Then to take the fire element, one attends to the body wherever one feels some kind of heat in the body. Just if one mindfully attends to one's body, one will feel some degree of bodily heat. Then one starts running the mind through the body to pick up, wherever one can, the sensation of bodily heat. And then one goes over and over through the body till at a certain point one feels the whole body is burning. One feels the bodily heat from the top of the head all the way down to the tip of the toes. Then to get the air element, one attends to some instance of expansion and contraction in the body. And this is seen most easily in the movement of the chest, the abdomen, as one is breathing in and out. This isn't the mindfulness of breathing, where one is attending to the sensation of the breath. But here the point is to attend to the sensation of expansion and contraction, the movement of some part of the body. Once one picks up that sense of movement, then one could run the mind through the body, and one will start picking up more and more concrete experiences of motion in the body, until when the mind becomes very subtle, one runs it through the whole body, and one feels motion everywhere in the body at very subtle levels. Sometimes it's very difficult at the beginning to pick up the meditation on the elements. And the way I had learned to do this meditation on the elements was in an extended course where we begin the first few days doing mindfulness of breathing, anapanasati. Because that gives increasing subtlety and flexibility to the mind. Okay, then after a few days, about 3 days of mindfulness of mindfulness of breathing, one takes parts of the body, moving from the head down to the toes, taking whole parts of the body. This isn't the same as the Goenka method of scanning the body, but one takes a whole part of the body. One might begin by taking the top of the head, just trying to feel it. When one feels the top of the head, then one will take the face. Just try to feel the face. When one gets some sensations in the face, then one moves down to the neck, front part of the neck. When one gets the neck, the sensations in the neck, then one goes to the shoulder, then right shoulder, upper part of the arm, lower part of the arm, hand, fingers. Then one goes back to the neck, left shoulder, again part by part down to the fingers. Then one comes back to the neck, chest, upper abdomen, lower abdomen, genital region, then down to right thigh, the lower part of the right leg, right foot or right toes, then back up to the hip region, then down to the left thigh, lower left leg, lower foot, left toes. Then one comes up, going up the legs, then up to lower back, upper back, back of each shoulder, back of the neck, back of the head, top of the head. And so one goes through the whole body like this, just attending to whatever sensations appear. One might do this a couple of days, so that one is becoming more and more sensitive to the parts of the body. Then one starts with the elements, beginning with the earth element and spending a whole day doing the earth element. Then maybe a whole day on the water element. Then the fire element. By the time one does the water element, one is able to pick up the sensations of the elements more easily. So one could do fire element in a half a day, air element in half a day. And then one starts alternating. After one has spent like a whole day attending to each element, then one starts alternating, going through the whole body, one turn for the earth element, one cycle for the liquid element, one cycle for the fire element, one cycle for the air element, and alternating like that. It said that at the next stage, one could take in all four elements simultaneously. But for myself, it was enough of a challenge to do them in alternating cycles. Okay, so this is two alternative ways of doing the meditation on the four elements. And that is sort of the standard element within the Pali Buddhist tradition. But here the Buddha teaches 6 elements. So we move on, paragraph 18, the space element. And we make a distinction between 2 types of space. One is what we might call all-embracing space, or universal space. And this is space considered as maybe the dimension that pervades everything and incorporates everything, so that everything occupies space. So that is the all-embracing space. But what is meant by the space element as an object of contemplation is the other kind of space element, which is what we might call vacuum space or unoccupied space. This is the space in between solid parts of matter. And so this is what is taken here, this unoccupied space or vacant space. Whatever internally belonging to oneself is space, spatial, and clung to, that is the holes of the ears. So the openings of the ears, which are not occupied by, well, of course they're occupied by air, but visually they're not occupied by anything solid. The nostrils, open space. The mouth, when we open the mouth is open. open space. That aperture by what is eaten, drunk, consumed, and tasted gets swallowed. That would be the esophagus, the food tube. Where it collects, that would be the space of the stomach. And whereby it is excreted from below, that would be the space in the intestines and the colon. But whatever else internally belonging to oneself is space, spatial, and clung to, this is called the internal space element. And then one goes on contemplating how internal space element, external space element are just space element. Okay, then there remains only consciousness, which is here said to be purified and bright. I think this is said because he's describing a meditator whose consciousness has now become very refined through contemplating the material elements. Now, what does one cognize with that consciousness? You see, consciousness element is very, very subtle, so it's very difficult to show the consciousness in itself. So in order to indicate the consciousness element, the Buddha is going to indicate its presence through the cognition of the feeling one is experiencing. So the feeling, this is pleasant, this is painful, this is neither painful nor pleasant, those are modes of what? Right, those are modes of the aggregate of feeling, the mental factor of feeling. Okay, so the Buddha shows the presence of consciousness through one's awareness of one's feelings, pleasant, painful, neutral feelings. Then he's going to show the dependent origination of feelings. In dependence on a contact to be felt as pleasant, there arises a pleasant feeling. When one feels a pleasant feeling, one understands, I feel a pleasant feeling. Then one understands with the cessation of that same contact to be felt as pleasant, its corresponding feeling, the pleasant feeling that arose in dependence on that contact to be felt as pleasant, that ceases and subsides. The same with painful feeling, the same with feeling that's neither painful nor pleasant. Okay, then the Buddha illustrates this with the simile of two fire sticks. So when two fire sticks are brought together and rubbed together, then from their friction, heat is generated and fire is produced. Then when the two fire sticks are separated, then the heat subsides and there's no fire. And so in the same way, it's through the coming together of the sense organ, with the coming together of the sense object with consciousness, through coming together of sense object with consciousness via the sense faculty, the internal sense base. This coming together of the three things, that is contact. Or let's say the coming together of object and consciousness through the sense faculty, that is contact. From that contact, they're coming together, feeling arises. If the contact is broken, if the mind turns away from that object, then that particular contact stops, and that feeling that arises from that contact, that ceases. Okay, so this takes us through the contemplation of the 6 elements. Are there any questions?
I don't see the difference between air and space.
But let us say that the space is occupied by air, but air would be the substance which is occupying the space. And the space is that in which the air exists. But the way we perceive it, we perceive, say, the opening of the mouth, the nostrils, the openings of the ears, to be space. And that space is what allows the air to come in there. If there wasn't that space that was solid, like the cheek, then the air couldn't get in. Yeah, do we have the other microphone? The mobile microphone? Okay, you wrong has it here. Heidi? Oh, I see you have to turn on.
One thing about the second, more specific method of contemplating the four elements. If the external elements are not included, if I pick up a distinctive feeling around my body,
Yeah.
then how can external four elements be included? And without that part, I cannot see there's no specific boundary between external and internal four elements or six elements. In that case, what's the goal or the purpose of contemplating four elements?
Eventually, once one gets very, very clear perception of the internal elements within the body, then one will move on to do the contemplation of the essential identity between the elements in the body and the external elements.
Essential identity?
What I call the essential identity, in that the elements of the body and the external elements all have the same characteristics. But one can't, well actually one can in a way experience the characteristic of the external elements. For example, if I touch something solid, I experience hardness, but I don't sit and meditate. When I'm sitting in meditation, the only hardness that I could experience would be the hardness of my bottom pressing against the cushion, or the hardness of my knees pressing against the ground. But if I'm sitting in meditation here, I don't experience hardness in the table or in the cup. So one has to work with what one can directly experience first. And then when one picks up the experience characteristic, then one does the reflective contemplation on the identity of the internal earth element, the essential identity, the identity and characteristics between the internal elements and the external elements.
Another question is the contemplation of the elements mainly used to achieve the understanding of non-self before the breakthrough? Because last week Bhante mentioned that before the major breakthrough to become a strong enter, one already understands non-self. And it seems to me the contemplation of elements are mainly used to achieve the understanding of non-self. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
And can the contemplation of four elements be used to achieve the breakthrough?
Oh yeah, of course it's a very important stage in the development of insight to make the breakthrough. Because in order to make what we call the breakthrough or the attainment of realization, one has to contemplate both the material factors of existence and the mental factors. And so the way one approaches the contemplation of the material side of existence is precisely through the contemplation of the four elements. And so the four elements in themselves are not sufficient for making the breakthrough. But first one comprehends the material side of existence through the four elements. Then one moves on to contemplate the mental side of existence by observing the four mental aggregates: feeling, perception, the mental formations, and consciousness. And so in this way one covers all 5 aggregates. And normally one will proceed even through the elements, well, one pretty much picks up first, generally, is the characteristic of impermanence, of anicca. Because when one is experiencing the elements in the body, one is perceiving them as arising and passing away. And then as the mind becomes more subtle, one picks up this arising and passing as occurring more and more quickly at increasingly subtle levels. And so one picks up the characteristic of impermanence first. But then one moves on from impermanence to dukkha, and then from dukkha to anatta, to non-self. But in this sutta, interestingly, the Buddha doesn't speak about impermanence or suffering. It seems that he moves, even in the other exercises that he explains, he moves directly into the characteristic of non-self. What I suspect is the reason is that this young monk seemed to have very sharp faculties. It said that even when he's this is in the commentary, when he first started to meditate, even the first shot, he achieved the 4 jhanas on mindfulness of breathing. So he already had very clear, very deep samatha, samadhi, and so he was able to move very directly into the characteristic of non-self.
In this last section on consciousness, it's describing basically breaking contact as the means to not having feelings arise.
Yeah.
And it seems like an advocation or a practice of isolation. And is that so? The Buddha has always taught this middle way of not being a complete ascetic, not breaking off all contact. So I'm a little puzzled. Is he talking about this being a practice that's a useful practice to go into isolation?
It's not no, I think you may be misunderstanding the idea of contact here. This isn't like breaking off human contacts. Is that the way you're understanding it?
Well, no, but in order to not have contact,
Yeah.
if my eyes are open,
Yeah.
I'm not talking about human contact particularly, I'm just
Okay.
talking about my eyes are open, then I'm going to, contact's going to arise, I would think.
Yeah. Okay, he's not speaking about ending all contact here, but what he's explaining is how one understands that feeling arises in dependence on contact. And so one sees that the feeling is something dependently originated. And one also sees that with the cessation of the contact, feelings, the corresponding feeling ceases. Actually, here we do have the characteristic of impermanence brought in. Because one sees that each contact is an individual event. From that event arises a particular feeling. When that contact stops, the feeling stops. And so this is not a prescription to end contact, but rather it's a prescription to observe how feeling is dependent upon contact, how feeling is something which is paticca samuppanna, dependently arisen. Okay, please. Take the microphone. You have it? Okay.
Could you say in more modern terms that contact is just like the physical process of electrical impulses, say, reaching the brain, and that feeling is the more difficult to describe, like experiential process of like recognizing it, perceiving?
I don't think the Buddha's text would understand it in that way. Because as I explained, that contact is said to, or it's formally defined as the coming together of 3 things. Coming together of consciousness, object, and sense faculty. And so it's not purely physiological, though definitely there would be a physiological process underlying the contact. But
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
yeah, let me just finish. So the way I understand this threefold union, it is the encounter of consciousness with its object through the sense faculty. And so it's a mental event contact. It's the coming together of consciousness with object. And then that is what gives rise to the feeling. Is that?
Well, I mean, I'm a grad student in the sciences, so I look at things from more of like a little bit of a scientific perspective.
Yeah.
So like I wouldn't think it's possible for consciousness to come directly into contact with an object per se. I would think it basically what you receive is entirely due to electrical impulses in the nerves, which arise due to interaction between your body and this other external object. Like in physical terms, it would be like there's an exchange of say photons between say your hand and like the table. Right. So it's an interaction between the electrons and photons and things in your hand and the table, which is mediated by these photons, which gives rise to electrolysis, which travel through your nerves and up into your brain. So, I mean, just from my perspective, this three object or this three component view seems a little bit outdated. So I'm just trying to rephrase it in terms of,
Yeah, but Buddhism would not subscribe, the Buddhist teaching would not subscribe to what I call a physical reductionism of consciousness.
Right. I mean, I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying it seems unlikely that your consciousness can come directly into contact with an external object.
Anyway, it's explaining in terms of, let's say in terms of the way we normally experience the world, rather than using this kind of physiological-based method of explanation. Please.
I have a question, you say that contact, we see the object and then we have feelings. It's like the person, I don't like the person, I see that and I have feeling and it's not pleasant because I get angry. If I don't see the person, but sometimes I still remember, I don't like the person. And I don't know, that kind of, no contact. The person is not in front of me. But I still don't like the person, what he does, what he do. I don't know how to explain that. It's because last week I asked about memory. It's because memory is a part of contact and it restores us or something.
Well, what gives rise to that unpleasant feeling when you think of the person is that there's taking place a mental contact. You're not having a contact with the physical form of the person, but somehow the idea of that person floats into the mind, and then when it becomes illuminated by consciousness, there's a contact taking place with the mental image, with memories of that person. Where the memory is stored, I don't know. This is a question that's not really dealt with in the early Buddhist texts. Any further questions? Okay, then we'll move on now to the next section. You see, I have listed on my syllabus for July 18th, 6 elements and dependent origination. So now we'll move on to the section on dependent origination. And I don't have to do this in extensive detail. Why not? Why not? Excuse me?
We've done so before.
Yeah, because when we were going through the discourse on right view, then we dealt in detail with the relationship between each pair of factors. So now we could explore dependent origination in a kind of concise way, just by way of recapitulating what we already covered. So, as the first sutta in this section, I took just the basic, simplest discourse of the Buddha on dependent origination, which just lays out the 12-fold formula in terms of arising and cessation. Okay, so what is dependent origination? With ignorance as condition, volitional formations come to be. With volitional formations as condition, consciousness. With consciousness as condition, nama-rupa, name and form. From name and form, the 6 sense bases. Then comes contact, then comes feeling, then craving, then clinging, then existence, becoming, then birth. Then with birth as condition, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection and despair. So that is the origin of the whole mass of suffering, and that's called dependent origination. Then comes the cessation side, the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance. Comes cessation of volitional formations. With cessation of volitional formations, cessation of consciousness, and so on and so forth, till at the end, with the cessation of birth, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection and despair cease. Such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. Okay, then I'll try to explain it concisely and then go through the table that I prepared. Okay, we start with aging and death, or old age and death. Why is it? What is the root condition of old age and death? Birth. The fact that we are born, that we come into existence. Why is it that we come into existence? What is it that has propelled us into this existence? And why have we taken birth in this particular form, under these particular conditions? The word that the Buddhist text uses, the condition, it's bhava. The word bhava is what's translated inadequately as existence. It might also be translated becoming. And the way the commentators explain bhava, they explain that it is the side of life, the side of existence in which we engage in volitional activities that create karma. And so it is this constant process of engaging in volitional activities, of building up karma, that propels us into a new existence, taking birth under particular forms. We're taking birth under a particular form, under particular conditions. Then why does one engage in these volitional activities, these good and bad actions that create karma? The underlying condition is clinging, this grasping to the body, to our experience, grasping to things as being mine, I, and myself. Okay, so what underlies that clinging? It's craving, the thirst for sense pleasures, for renewed existence. Even the craving for personal annihilation becomes a condition leading on to new existence. Okay, so why does craving occur? What is the nourishment for craving? Feeling. Why does feeling occur? What is its condition? Contact. How does contact occur? Contact occurs through the 6 sense bases. Because we have eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind faculty, contact can take place between consciousness and its objects. So these are the 6 sense bases as the condition for contact. And what is the condition for the 6 sense bases? How do the 6 sense bases arise and develop? They arise from nama-rupa. Nama-rupa is the sentient organism, the complex or compound of form or body, and what's called nama, translated inadequately as name, but it's all of the cognitive functions of an organism. So name and form comes into being at the time of conception. It starts to develop. As it develops, it brings forth the 6 sense bases. And through the 6 sense bases, we make contact with the world, and that contact gives rise to feeling. Okay, why does name and form start to develop as an embryo? Because consciousness comes in, the stream of consciousness flowing on from a previous existence, takes root in the womb. The stream of consciousness links up with the fertilized ovum, initiates the process of embryonic development, which brings forth the 6 sense bases. Okay, how does that stream of consciousness come into the womb? What is it that directs the stream of consciousness to a particular destination? What is it, the propulsive force within and behind that stream of consciousness? It is the volitional formations in which we engage. Again, our volitional activities. These volitional activities are what we call the sankharas, the creative forces, the constructive forces. And these constructive forces condition consciousness so that consciousness moves as it goes from one life to the next. It moves into a particular realm of rebirth. And once it has moved into that realm, it starts the development of name and form, Namarupa. And so it is volitional formations, volitional activities that condition consciousness. And why do our actions give rise to these volitional formations? Why do our activities have this potential to create new existence, to construct our identities from life to life? Here the Buddha finds that the underlying root is avidya, ignorance, not knowing the truth about things. Okay, so this is a concise explanation. And now we can see, in order to get a good, what we call a global grasp of dependent origination, how all of these 12 factors hold together, I've constructed this chart which follows the method of explanation that we find in the commentarial texts, like the Visuddhimagga. Okay, the commentaries divide the links of dependent origination into 3 time periods. This actual explicit division we don't find in the Nikayas themselves, but in my mind it's the only way to really make sense out of the 12 factors of dependent origination. And we actually do find, or at least I find, some evidence in the suttas that supports the division of the 12 factors into 3 time periods. Okay, so in this scheme, ignorance and volitional formations, let's say in the scheme we take any 3 lives, any 3 existences, and then the 12 factors extend over these 3 existences. So if we take the middle existence to be the present period, then ignorance and volitional formations, relative to the factors that follow them, are assigned to the past period of time, the previous life. So it's the ignorance and the volitional formations, volitional activities of the past that bring into being, in this existence, consciousness and name and form. Once we have consciousness and name and form, those 2 factors themselves can account for the whole life process. Everything that goes on in our lives is the interplay of consciousness with name and form. But now the Buddha wants to show how, from this interplay of consciousness and name and form, a new existence is going to be created. The causal factors that will give rise to that new existence are craving and clinging. And so the Buddha wants to show what, in this interplay of name and form with consciousness, what are the factors that we draw out as the underlying conditions for craving. So we trace craving back to feeling, because craving, what we crave for basically is pleasant feeling. If we experience painful feeling, then we turn away from the painful feeling to indulge in pleasant feeling. And if we experience this peaceful, neutral feeling, then we become attached to it with a subtle attachment to that neutral feeling. Or else if it's a boring, neutral feeling, then we again turn away from it and seek pleasant feeling. And so craving arises based on feeling through contact through the 6 sense bases. And so the Buddha draws out from name and form the 6 sense bases, contact and feeling, as the conditions that give rise to new craving. Then craving, clinging together lead into a fresh round of karmic activities. These karmic activities, that is the karmic existence, which will create in the future a new birth followed by new aging and death. So in this way, the 12 factors get distributed into 3 existences, 3 life periods. And then among these 12 factors, there are 3 important connections. The first is the connection between past causes with present effects. This is the link between volitional formations and consciousness. So the volitional formations belong to the past period, and consciousness belongs to the present life. I actually consider this something of an oversimplification. The way I would see it actually is that while one is engaging in those volitional formations, of course there's consciousness. And consciousness, the volitional activities are constantly conditioning the consciousness that is occurring along with them. And then those volitional activities are creating the karmic propensities that get deposited in that stream of consciousness. But as the death takes place and the rebirth process unfolds, it's the karmic formations that have been conditioning the stream of consciousness that now direct the consciousness onward to the new life, so that consciousness will spring up with a fresh identity in a new birth under new conditions. Okay, so the first connection is between past causes and present effects. The second connection is between feeling and craving. Because feeling is considered something that results from the past. Because of our ignorance and volitional formations from the past life, we acquire this body with its consciousness. Then the 6 sense bases are constantly making contact, and we're constantly undergoing feelings. All this is coming about through these conditions that we acquire from the past. A body endowed with senses and with consciousness. And so feelings are inevitable as long as we have this sentient organism. But then there's an important gap between the feelings we experience and what comes next. If we let ourselves be governed by the feelings, then the feelings will give rise to craving. So the pleasant feeling will directly give rise to a craving to experience more of that pleasant feeling. As I explained just a minute ago, the painful feeling will give rise to a craving for some new feeling, a pleasant feeling. And the neutral feeling will be either clung to, or if it gets boring, we crave exciting, pleasant feelings. So in this way, there's a gap between feeling and craving. And if we apply mindfulness and clear comprehension to the feelings, then the feelings will not trigger fresh craving. When we apply mindfulness and clear comprehension, we prevent the feelings from giving rise to new craving. And instead we could bring in wisdom here in order to understand that the feelings are something which are conditioned. We could see, as the previous passage on the elements makes clear, we see how each feeling arises through its corresponding contact, how the feeling ceases with the cessation of that contact. And in this way we can see the impermanence and conditioned nature of feelings. Even without going into the conditionality, we could simply observe the feelings as they arise and pass away, arise and pass away. And then instead of responding to the feelings with craving, we become the observers of feeling and draw back from them. And that way we're able to master our mind, master our reactions, and we stop being the servant of craving. Okay, but this sequence is dealing with the forward movement of the round. And so we go from craving to clinging. Clinging is really just an intensification of craving. And then through this clinging, we start engaging in new activities, new karmic activities. Okay, so then the third connection or third link is what takes place between the present causes and future effects. That is the link between karmically active existence and birth. Karmic activity is what takes place in this life, and then this karmic activity at death will generate a new birth into a new realm of existence. So that is a connection or a gap. Or that's a gap that's connected. Okay, so those are the three connections. Okay, now, and this is important, especially important to avoid misunderstanding of the 12-fold scheme. This is the grouping of the factors according to what are called the 20 modes and the 4 groups. Okay, we speak, when we take the 12 factors laid out in a straight line, we speak as though ignorance and volitional formations belong to the past, and craving, clinging, and karmic existence belong to the present. But that is an oversimplification made simply in order to create this neat scheme for the purpose of exposition, for the purpose of disclosing the sequence of conditions. But if we take all of the sutras on dependent origination and look at them together, we could see that whenever there is ignorance and volitional formations, along with them there is craving and clinging. And what we call karmic existence, karmically active existence, and volitional formations are really just two different names for the same thing. And so when we speak about ignorance and volitional formations, alongside with them, there's craving, clinging, and karmic existence. So we find in the past that there are 5 causes, all 5 causes. And then when we come to the present causes, when we have craving, clinging, karmic existence, of course there has to be ignorance. Because ignorance is the root of craving. And then karmic existence is another name for volitional formations. So we also have number 2, volitional formations. And so in the present, we actually have 5 causes generating new existence. The presently occurring craving, clinging, karmic existence, along with ignorance and volitional activities. Okay, then, taking a step backwards, the 5 effects that occur in the present, that's consciousness and name and form, those are the 2 main factors. Then within name and form, we find coming out from them the 6 sense bases, through the 6 sense bases, contact, through contact, feeling. So these are 5 effects occurring in the present, resulting from our previous ignorance, volitional activities, craving, clinging, and karmic existence. Then we speak about the future, birth, life, and then aging and death. But what is actually present when there's birth, life, aging, and death? What comes into being at birth is consciousness and name and form. Then as the organism develops, the 6 sense bases appear, the being makes contact with the sense objects and experiences feelings. And so in the future too, we can speak about 5 future effects. That is, factors 3 through 7 also occur in the future. Okay, then these 12 factors of dependent origination are organized into 3 groups, which are called the 3 rounds. The most basic is the round of defilements. These are the factors that represent defilements. This is ignorance, craving, and clinging. 1, 8, and 9. So it's because we have ignorance that we have craving, and because we have craving that we cling to things and hold to them as I, mean, and mine. Then because of the defilements, we engage in activities, usually unwholesome activities, sometimes wholesome activities, and these activities create karma. So we have the round of karma, that is the volitional formations, the sankharas, and the karmically active existence, number 10. And then we have the round of results resulting from the karma and defilements, that is the 5 factors from consciousness to feeling. Then we have birth, aging, and death. And then if we take the life as a whole, as the resultant existence, we could also consider number 10 as existence resulting from past karma, as being included in the round of results. So we have these 3 rounds. The defilements give rise to karmic activities. Karmic activities lead to the results. Based on these results, as long as we have ignorance, new defilements arise. Through these defilements, we engage in new karmic activities. These karmic activities bring fresh results. Based on the fresh results, new defilements arise, leading to new karma, new results. And so in this way, the round of samsara turns without conceivable beginning, from time without discoverable beginning. And then the 2 most potent factors in maintaining the round of existence are called the 2 roots. This is ignorance, moving from the past into the present, but it also moves from the present into the future. And then craving, which is shown moving from the present into the future, but craving is also moved from the past into the present. So we have the two roots, ignorance and craving. Okay, at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions. Please.
Don't the same factors occur in every lifetime?
In fact, that's what I said.
No.
Yeah, the factors do occur in every lifetime, but just for the purpose of showing, sort of laying out a convenient scheme for showing how they operate. They're distributed into 3 lives. But if one looks at this column called 20 modes in 4 groups, one sees that it's the same factors occurring in every lifetime. Okay, Richard?
I was curious why birth, aging, and death aren't listed as effects in the 20 modes of the world.
I've wondered about that too. What I think is that they wanted to have a neat scheme having 5 in the past, 5 causes in the past, 5 effects in the present, 5 causes in present, 5 effects in the future. If you put birth, aging, and death in, then you upset the symmetry of it. That's the only explanation I could think of. Okay, so please.
I don't know whether you already explained and I missed. About the 3 rounds, number 2 round of karma you included number 2 and number 10. The number 10 which is karmic existence. And then in parentheses, you say part.
Yeah.
So in part,
Yeah.
10 belongs to.
Yeah. In my explanation, I tried to make it a little simpler because it gets a little bit complicated. But okay, how to handle this? Okay, factor number 10 was called bhava, is actually distinguished by the commentators into 2. Let's say they make a division in this factor bhava, a 2-fold division between what they call kama bhava and upapatti bhava. Okay, kama bhava is what I've called karmic existence or karmically active existence. This is the side of life, the occasions in life when we are creating new karma that will bring effects in the future. But then what's called upapatti bhava, this could be translated rebirth existence or resultant existence. This is the side of existence that results from the past karma. And so the way I see the relationship, through karmic existence, we create the karma. That karma becomes active at the time of death, and it builds up and creates for us a new existence. That's the upapatti bhava. Then that new existence begins with birth. Birth, jati, birth is actually conception. And then that upapatti bhava actually continues through the whole course of the new life. Whenever we are reaping the results of our past karma. And then from birth there comes aging and death. Okay, so to keep my explanation simple, I just kept to the karmic existence, which follows this neat scheme of dividing up the factors. But to bring in a fuller explanation, we have to divide bhava into these two aspects and see that the karmic existence, karma bhava, creates resultant existence or rebirth existence, upapatti bhava. And that rebirth existence begins with the event of birth or conception and then continues from there.
I'm not sure what it is I'm not getting, but in the sutta itself, there's, with the fading away paragraph, early in it is the cessation of consciousness.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this is recommending as a way away from suffering and the whole mass of suffering.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think this means you should become unconscious.
Okay, this is a good question. Because what I've explained so far by means of the table is only the sequence of arising. But when we come to the sequence of cessation, this is the way I understand it, that the sequential cessation laid out in the text, so you stop ignorance, then you stop volitional formations, then you stop consciousness, then you stop name and form, and so on, is laid out in this way, again, only for convenience of exposition. But what we have to understand, in this life, what actually stops? What does one actually eliminate in this life when one reaches the full enlightenment or arhatship? What one eliminates is ignorance. Let's say what one eliminates first is ignorance, craving, and clinging. Those are the defilements. Because one eliminates ignorance, craving, and clinging, one no longer creates any more karma. One still acts, an enlightened person still acts. With vigorous energy, they can act. But their actions no longer create these sankharas, volitional formations. But an enlightened person will continue to be conscious, to have name and form, to have the 6 sense bases, to experience contacts, to experience feelings through the course of the life. As long as the body lasts, as long as life continues, all of these factors are present. So those don't stop with the cessation of ignorance and craving and clinging. They don't stop immediately. So the liberated person, enlightened person continues on experiencing, but the experiences don't, since there's no longer any underlying ignorance and craving, the experiences give rise to no more clinging, no creation of new karma. Then, when the enlightened person passes away, then there is no projection of the consciousness into a new form of existence. So that is the cessation of consciousness. And then, because there's no arising of consciousness, then there's no name and form, sense bases, contact, feeling, no birth, no aging and death. So those are all the things that cease. Okay, we'll take. Were you going to ask a question?
Yes.
Oh, okay, please. Because I just caught the hand in the back, but I'll take you first. No.
This could be an oversimplified question, and since I've not been here in the last year and a half, you may have answered it somewhere along the way. The whole Buddhist concept of suffering is the underlying fundamental.
Yeah.
Is there any concept of joy or positiveness?
Oh, definitely.
Appreciation of beauty, because I'm sure I've missed it somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to figure out how those positive things fit into this.
If you just look at this, you think, oh my God, everything is suffering. Yeah, but there's many different types of happiness, joy, and especially there are different grades of happiness and joy. So as one goes, there's worldly happiness and joy, which is definitely joyful in its way, but it's something which is bound up with suffering and vulnerable to suffering. And so the Buddha teaches the way to a higher happiness and joy. And then this comes through cultivating the different stages of the path. Each one brings its happiness, joy, until there comes the ultimate happiness, which is the happiness of liberation.
I'll read the beginning of the book.
Yeah, I have to begin. And also, all of the lectures are recorded now. We have to put them up on our website. If you like, you can get the link to all the earlier lectures. You, Vong, would you raise your hand?
I have all the audio on web.
If you could just write maybe your... Okay, we'll take one question in the back, then I'll have to stop.
You said that like craving even for personal annihilation is still craving.
Yeah.
But isn't that like similar to like desiring to be out of samsara? Or obviously there's a difference between that, but
yeah, one could say desire. Usually we don't speak about the desire to be liberated from samsara as a kind of craving. But it doesn't matter. Even if one could say, okay, it's a craving, but it's the craving that will end craving.
okay, but like when you meant like desire for personal annihilation, you meant just like an ignorance sort of like wanting to just cease from existence? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. Alright, thanks.
Okay, we'll stop now, but at 12 o'clock we'll have more discussion, if anybody wants to stay for the discussion. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits. My weekly test of patience. Does the gong sound longer on Saturday than on the other days of the week? Start over. Akasata Chumata. And louder on Saturday. Akasata Chumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumodika Chirang Rakantu Sasanam. Akasata Chumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumodika Chirang Rakantu Desanam. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mang Parang Etavatacha Amhehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya shortly Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Pavagupadaya Avici Hetato Etantare Satakai Upapanna Rupya Rupicha Asanya Sanino Dukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Nibutin